Hey everyone. So the working title for this paper is What You're After, Second Person Address and the Narrativity of Olya Hercules' Summer Kitchens. Before we really jump into things, there are two big claims that I'll be getting into with my paper. The first concern is far broader and argues for the high narrativity of Olya Hercules' Summer Kitchen as being emblematic of cookbooks as a genre. I'll be presenting on this, but in a pretty cursory manner. The majority of my presentation will relate to the second claim, that Hercules establishes and relies on an intimacy between the largely homodiegetic binary of you and I. I argue that Hercules uses this relationship between a reader character and the implied author as a narrative scaffolding for the Ukrainian story world that she wants to create. Apologies that I'll be glossing over so much in this slide, but I just wanted to give a taste here of where my essay will be going. This part of my argument is directly in response to Brian Richardson's claim that second-person address is specifically a fictional literary phenomenon, as cookbooks are only pseudo-narrative. My argument uses Marco Caracciolo's idea of object-oriented plotting as a defense for the narrativity of Hercules' work. Caracciolo argues that some plots decenter the human agents of a text to draw emphasis to the non-human and resist the anthropocentric bias of narrative, though they can never fully shake that bias. In order to maintain narrative coherence, these plots use material anchors as a through line in place of traditional anthropocentric markers. For example, character arcs are Freytag's pyramid of conflict, crisis, and resolution. I argue that each recipe does this same kind of work. So I've provided images of this recipe with each component of the narrative highlighted over the next couple of slides. I tried to make them as large as possible for the sake of this video, but I'll also be reading the important parts out loud if my scans aren't quite clear enough. I'll go through them in order of lowest narrativity to highest. This first image highlights the list of ingredients needed for the dish. In isolation, this has an extremely low level of narrativity. However, taken as a whole, it's important to note that the listed ingredients are ordered chronologically based on the sequence provided in the recipe itself. In our example here, we see that the 6 tablespoons of pearl barley are the first ingredient that the flesh and blood reader would work with in order to cook the cabbage rolls. Next highest in narrativity is the recipe itself, which includes our first characters. There is a more experienced I here that directs you how to prepare the sour cabbage leaf rolls. For the most part, however, the use of second person pronoun throughout is only implied, since the vast majority of the sentences here are written in an imperative form, such as with the first sentence of the recipe, put the pearl barley into a pan of cold salted water and bring to a boil, which omits the use of the subject pronoun, you. When the you pronoun does show up, though, it provides a really interesting opportunity for metalepsis. The opening of the second paragraph reads, "Now for the sauce. First of all, do not be alarmed at the amount of garlic. We will cook it slowly until it is mellow. Heat the oil and butter in a small cast iron casserole or saucepan over low heat, and when it foams, add the garlic. Cook, stirring from time to time until you get that heady smell of confit garlic. Watch it closely. You don't want it to brown at all." The first thing that I'd like to note about this passage is the reassurance, "We will cook the garlic slowly until it is mellow." This first person plural anticipates a reader that balks at the required 10 large garlic cloves thinly sliced. Then the author attempts to comfort the reader character by positioning herself closer in an imagined kitchen space that is shared. This proximity can only be imagined, so we see a clear line drawn between the implied reader and the flesh and blood reader. With the next direct address, however, that distinction collapses. The marker, "until you get that heady smell of confit garlic," is a descriptor that is both read and imagined, as well as actually smelled during the cooking process. Similarly, the warning to "watch it closely, you don't want the garlic to brown," gives a sense of qualia that operates both imaginatively as well as literally, so as to ensure that the dish is prepared properly. The section with the highest narrativity is bolded at the top of the page. I refer to this section as the anecdote, in part because, while still narrative, these sections rarely deal with anything like the conflict, crisis, and resolution that are traditionally associated with stories or autobiography. Instead, the anecdote's narrative gives priority to the material anchor, the dish itself. There is common reference to you throughout, but unlike the recipe, there is no collapse between the character reader and the flesh and blood reader. The I still addresses an imagined reader. However, these anecdotes are still highly populated by other characters as well. The narrator describes interactions with family and friends or even entire regions of Ukraine. Without fail, however, each anecdote tells how the narrator first encountered the presented dish, often incorporating family history and even occasionally citing published works of literature that describe the meal. This leaves us with a character arc of sorts. Rather than revealing an emotional journey or epiphany, however, the anecdote ends with the narrator learning the recipe that she will then pass on to the imagined you. I also want to note that these anecdotes, with their bolded typeface, draw the eye immediately. Similarly, their position next to the name of the dish makes the anecdote the next intuitive spot to read. These sections then function something like a first impression to the qualia of each particular recipe. In this example, the reader is told that this dish has always had a bit of a legendary feel to it, because the narrator's grandmother stopped making them when she was young. She also refers to the prized leaves left by the kraut sellers in the market that would be snatched up to make cabbage rolls. The force of the verb snatched and the legendary feeling give an impression here of scarcity and luxury. But it's important to note that the scarcity and luxury is now one that the flesh and blood reader is invited to join, assuming that they cook the cabbage rolls. We've talked frequently throughout the semester about the literary performative, so I really wanted to highlight here the fascinating ways that cookbooks or recipes in any format really can interact with this concept. Kakandas writes that the literary performative can be performed only by the reader and require the participation of at least two persons. They are enunciated by a speaker, the writer, but they are only performed when read by someone. Her example of this is, "You are proceeding through this sentence nicely." This is one of the central ideas that I'm working with in this paper. Comparing Hercules, we see that the manipulation is not on the same level. Simply by reading, "You are proceeding through this sentence nicely," we perform it, and the only way out of that is to not read the sentence at all. This semester, I have learned, somewhat to my chagrin, that it is entirely possible to read this entire cookbook while performing none of it. This doesn't mean that the flesh and blood reader isn't imposed upon, however. I want to backtrack a little bit to my last point about the cabbage rolls. Hercules presents a story world that feels extremely rich despite its economy. The narrator, who so prizes these cabbage rolls that she recreates the recipe based on her mother's description of them. Then we close with a scene of a town frantically running to the women at the pickle stalls to get the limited number of whole cabbage leaves left at the bottom of their sauerkraut brine. And then comes the recipe. The imposition here on a flesh and blood reader is that Hermann's definition of qualia, that sense of what it was like, doesn't have to remain imagined. By decentering the human agents, the narrative allows for a partial recreation of the story world in the physical dish. For my last close reading, I want to spend a little time with this recipe for Christmas borscht with mushroom dumplings. In the introduction prior to this recipe, titled On Borscht, Hercules defines borscht as an unblended soup that involves beet and as many as 70 other ingredients, depending on region, season, occasion, and taste, and declares without qualm that I am not afraid to claim borscht here as Ukrainian, despite acknowledging that the dish maintains a staggering international range of variation. Regional adaptations, according to this definition, perform a recipe that remains fundamentally Ukrainian, though simultaneously multicultural. The invitation that is presented both to the implied reader and the flesh and blood reader that cooks any of these variations is the opportunity to participate in the Ukrainian story world. So while the chapter is organized under the larger umbrella terms of soups and broths, there remains a nationalist distinction in the story world for all the soups that fit into her definition of borscht, regardless of where that recipe may have originated. This regional specificity is maintained throughout the chapter. Hercules writes here, "Unlike the thick, almost stew-like borschts I grew up with, this is a rather elegant affair, a beaten mushroom consommé of sorts, and it comes from western Ukraine near the Polish border." Hercules' description is almost by necessity framed first around her memory of the stew-like borschts of her childhood, and only after that does she give the more technical description, drawing contrasts with consommes and a likely French-influenced international cuisine, before finally locating the recipe in western Ukraine on the Polish border. These contrasted descriptions, however, function, as in the previous recipe, to expand our sense of qualia. The reader knows more explicitly the way the borscht should taste. They should be looking for a rather elegant affair rather than a rustic stew. Unlike the cabbage rolls, the anecdote section of the Christmas Borscht never addresses the reader character. The recipe, though, addresses the second person on 8 separate occasions, most often as a point of reference, like when you hear the shallots sizzle, cover with a wet cartouche. In this case, the flesh and blood is imposed upon because the next step in instructions depends on literal completion of the previous task. This imposition, however, doesn't remove the recipe from the established story world of the anecdote. Hercules, towards the end of the instructions, writes that what you're after is a flavorsome, sweet and sour, deep crimson clear consomme. This echoes the earlier description to the broth in the anecdote, illustrating narrative coherence between sections, similar to the way we see the ingredients list echoing the narrative sequence of the recipe. One of the more interesting aspects about second-person narrative theory is how unstable the status of you remains throughout. Even in moments like Kikanda's literary performative, the identification with the second person fluctuates constantly. Kikanda's writes about the opening of Calvino's If on a Winter's Night a Traveler, noting that the minute that Calvino's Italian genders the second person as a male, she is removed from the you. This leaves something like a spectrum of identification with the second person. On one hand, complete immersion, on the other, alienation from the character reader that is distinct from the flesh and blood reader. So my big question then is, who does the narrator address? I'm still trying to get a handle on the relationship between the narrator and the character reader, but also, what are the traits that are ascribed to this character? Anyway, thanks for watching, y'all. I'm excited to hear people's thoughts on this.